Hi everyone, my name's, oh wait, I'm not sure, are you seeing my screen? Okay, great. Okay, awesome. Has everyone seen the screen, the presentation?
No, you can start sharing your screen now, I think.
Okay. Is this okay?
Perfect, yeah.
Okay, so first and foremost, thank you for this invitation. I really appreciate being able to present in this forum and to be able to discuss the stuff that we've been up to over the past few years. And I'd also noted that we're quite a small group, which is fine. I think that's cool. And I think that would be an opportunity for us actually to have a lovely discussion. So I'm keen not to just, let's say, go on a monologue for an hour or so. And let's just keep this session as kind of interactive as possible. So please do jump in with questions. I think Francisca mentioned to just maybe raise your hand or put a question in the chat bar. But like, please, let's keep it as interactive as possible. And I'm really open to having using this as a kind of discussion group rather than just a kind of straightforward presentation. So what I'm going to be talking about today is algorithm auditing. So I think probably most of you are familiar with this space or familiar with the general AI ethics space and how it's kind of evolved over the past 4 or 5 years. And the concept of audit, if you will, is something which, in a way, I'm going to situate it after I contextualize how we've come to this kind of discussion. It was our way of resolving the problem of operationalizing AI ethics. So think of this as a kind of, just think about the problem, if you will, as AI ethics or implications or social political implications of algorithms on wider society or on systems. And our solution to that, or our approach to that in this particular work, was to say, can we do some kind of auditing of the systems themselves? So this work came out of the computer science department at University College London. The work was led by Adriano Koshiyama, and I supported him, and so did Treleavan. As a kind of background, our team came from the financial computing group, and the group has been doing this kind of stuff for decades. So in the 90s, there was work on the algorithmic trading systems and the fraud detection of those algorithmic trading systems. And the work has been going, and we were developing, or the group was developing a lot of this kind of early work. And then looking at the kind of assessment of these trading algorithms, or being able to assess, or be able to let's say monitor kind of fraud in these systems, was a kind of allay or a pathway into, let's say, law tech or reg tech. So the group has been doing lots and lots of stuff in law tech, reg tech. We've got stuff on computer executionable contracts. There's lots and lots of startups that come out of this group. So we're part of a wider ecosystem of general reg tech and law tech research, as well as companies that come out in this space. So the work that we did was the algorithm auditing and assurance. And the way in which the work emerged, as I was just trying to kind of tease right at the start of this, was that there was a discussion in 2017 convened by Professor Philip Treleavan on a national certification service. So Philip and the great and the good all got together. These were major industry players, as well as NGOs, as well as a lot of regulators. So in our context, it was the Financial Conduct Authority, Bank of England, etc. And everyone was concerned, if you will, the target was the certification of algorithms. And we were moving from let's say, a broad discussion about AI ethics and the increasing consciousness regarding the kind of implications and impact of these algorithms on society, into the question of operationalizing those ethics. So there was lots and lots of activity. I remember when we were first doing this in 2018, we were discussing it in terms of algorithm impact assessments. So what happened was, after we had these kind of conversations, and there were the beginnings of this kind of work, I put talk shop there. I probably should have removed it from the presentation, but the concern was that there was no real kind of empirical basis for the conversations. There was no, let's say, engineering solution or attempt to look at kind of systems themselves. So 2 kinds of work stream were initiated. One kind of work stream was the development of synthetic data sets. So that was to test and certify systems according to, let's say, with reference to or via these data sets that of which we knew the composition, etc. And that work was picked up by a good colleague of ours called Luetge, who's at the University of Edinburgh, and also the Alan Turing Institute. And that work still continues. A good colleague of ours, and we can talk about that separately. So the second piece of work that was initiated was to say, can we audit an algorithm? Can we actually assess and look at an algorithm? And that work was given to Adriano, and I jumped on that team. Adriano Koshiyama was a PhD student at the time in computer science, and he was looking at his research was grounded in the assessment of trading algorithms or robustness in the trading algorithms. And we, let's say, reappropriated some of that work to look at algorithmic assessment more generally. So what we did is we published a paper, quite a lengthy paper, and that's what I'm going to be presenting to you today, or all parts of it today. And that work was a very theoretical piece of work, as you're going to see, and that's why I'll skip quite quickly through it. But just kind of foreshadowing some of the questions. What happened was that towards algorithm auditing paper initiated a big discussion, and it got picked up by the civil service in the UK, and the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation approached us to say, can you conduct audits? Can you actually go and do audits and report back to us on the nature of those audits? Now, they were not concerned, the civil service, who were moving towards the, let's say, codification or proposing standards and regulations in this space. They were not concerned so much with the nitty-gritty of the audits. They were not concerned about this statistic or that metric. They were much more interested, and I think this is why I'm keen to keep this group here, and we can do this as a conversational piece. They were much more interested in the landscape. So what's the level of maturity in terms of auditing or assurance of algorithms? What's the appetite? Who are we speaking to in industry? Who is actually interested in this? Is it the data scientist? Is it the chief compliance officer? Is it the internal auditor? Is it the chief data officer? And so on and so forth. What's the relationship with, say, the data protection officers and this kind of work? So really a lot of the work was feeding back just in terms of the landscape and, let's say, meaningfully, how is this actually impacting in industry or in the world? So I'll jump on to the actual presentation itself. I've noticed some more people have jumped on, and I just want to reiterate what I was saying before, which is, you know, we've got about an hour session, hour and 15 minutes. I'm keen not to have this just as one long monologue. I think we should just be as conversational as possible. So what I'm going to do is probably, I think the interesting parts are probably towards the end of the presentation, when we're talking about the stuff that we actually did, the pilots that we run, and all the audits that we've been doing in industry. But I'll talk about the theory first. So yeah, so just, this is an open invitation for everyone to just jump in or butt in, ask questions and contribute. And I'll just maybe move through the actual theory now, and then we can turn at the end to the experiences that we had in industry. So in a way, this is a kind of silly question. Let me ask the question, actually. Let me get this, let's stimulate the group here and ask, why algorithm auditing? Like, why should we care about, why should we audit algorithms? Like, why should we care? Why auditing and not impact assessments? Why not process? Yeah, so has anyone got any points, any contributions? I was gonna say, don't leave me hanging. Okay, so our view, let's say, this is on a kind of macro scale, is yes, accountability. I think Manuel has just put in there. Also, I think that's the big question, I guess. So anyway, how do we solve AI ethics, or the problem of this algorithmic impact, and how do we do so in a manner in which just going to move this here. Oh, how do we do this in a manner in which we're able to actually ascribe responsibility? So our view is that the last decade, the 2010s, if you will, was all about big data. It was about data protection. And if you look at the kind of legislative agendas and all of the kind of activity, it really was about data protection. And our view is that the next decade is going to be about algorithm conduct. So it's really going to be defined from big data to big algo. We think that this is going to dominate the legislative, the ethics debate. And we think that probably the same way as we've got a very vibrant and mature data protection space, I think we're going to have the same thing for algorithms by the end of the decade. So that's our view. And I think it's quite trivial. I think everyone here probably gets it, that, you know, there's an exponential growth in the use of algorithms, and the impact is just becoming more and more acute on society. The second thing is, I think this is, again, probably not something we need to particularly make an argument for this particular group, but there's lots and lots of activity in terms of the regulation. In a way, you can kind of see even the images that we've got on the side are already redundant. They've already been lots and lots of other interventions, probably the most important of which was the IEAI Act. That's probably done the most for stimulating the space and just creating the urgency in regulators and in practitioners and wider society. But we've also seen lots and lots of stuff taking place in the United States. In the UK, where I'm based, we've seen just in the last week or so, the Cabinet Office published a public sector algorithm standard. And we know that there was already work by the Future of the Institute of Work, which is I think does a lot of the policy work for the All Parliamentary Group on the Future of Work. And they were proposing an Algorithm Accountability Act. So in different jurisdictions, in different places, even outside of the EU, there's lots and lots and lots of activity in this space. So it's making it much more acute. So let's talk about what is algorithm auditing. So this is really the paper that kind of stimulated a lot of our work and a lot of our engagement with industry, and has brought a lot of attention to what we've been doing, and has and led actually the civil service to come and approach us to actually do some of this work in practice. And just this is the paper. The link here is below. You know, this is really where it kind of created this acuteness. So what we do when we talk about algorithm auditing is we usually divide between governance audit and technical audit. Now, of course, there is an intricate relationship, an intimate relationship between governance audit and technical audit. And what do we mean by technical audit? We mean just looking at the system itself, being able to kind of stress test, look at metrics, look at code, look at data, actually be able to investigate the algorithm and the model and so on and so forth. And what do we mean by governance audit? Well, governance audit, we mean things like taxonomy of responsibility, you know, ascribing responsibility, hierarchies of responsibility, reporting, trainings, reskilling, etc., etc. So in a way, the kind of governance audit is just good governance generally. There's lots and lots of stuff lots and lots of brilliant work already done in governance, corporate governance, technology governance. And really, the only reason we make this division is not to say that there are two kinds of audit that should be done independently of one another. They're very much intricately related. But what we're interested in is actually the technical audit in this paper. The reason for that is because we believe our position is that in order to do a meaningful governance audit, in order to meaningfully report, one has to have some kind of relationship with the engineering. There should be some points of contact with the engineering, or at least the ability to be able to meaningfully assess or discuss what is taking place at the level of the code or the algorithm itself. So that's what we mean by that. So the second thing is, and probably this is something that keeps on coming up, is when we talk about algorithm audits or assurance, at what point are we talking about this? So we can do an assessment in the development phase. In fact, we can even look at we can do this at point of inception or ideation, where a project is just pitched or a project is just looked at. One can do an audit at that stage, if you will. You can do an audit when the system is in development, so we can really start to look, or when the system is, if you will, live. So there's two other parts of this. So when a system is actually in production or deployed, you can do an audit at that point. And then we can audit, if you will. So mitigation is a complex one because we can audit and then propose mitigations, or we can even audit the mitigations that have been proposed for any risks that are present within a system. And then finally, when we talk about assurance, and this again, the word is a bit, it's a word actually we coined, and we were happy to see that this was adopted by the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation in the UK government, is just to say that at the end of this process, once we've done we've done the assessments, we've done the mitigations, we've looked at the whole thing, can we at the end actually say this is assured or this is trustworthy? And usually we talk about that in the context of different kinds of assurance. So it could be against the standard, it could be against law, could be against best practice, could be against benchmarks, etc., etc. So that's what we're looking at. Okay, so I'm not. So let's say at each stage, you know, inception or productionization, deployment, mitigation, etc. We can look at different parts of we can look at different things. We can look at the data, So usually they're, input, output, simulation environment, lots and lots of the interventions or lots and lots of the auditing is usually done on the data. There's a strong view that the relationship between the data and how the system performs is obviously foundational. So lots and lots of the work is actually assessing the data. We can look at the model. That's something we're particularly interested in, to look at hot model parameters, objective function, etc., etc. We can assess that in an audit. And we can look at the process, the design process, decision making, source libraries, etc., etc. So here it's just to highlight that even so we can look, let's say, at the point at which the system is being used, from inception to deployment. We can look at each one of those points within reason, depending on what we can access. We can look at different parts. So the audit. So what we're doing here is that what I'm trying to make the point in this particular in this particular slide, and more generally, that when we actually break down an audit, we need to talk about the time, the point in the pipeline that the audit is taking place, and we need to pinpoint exactly what we're assessing at each point. So this here is, so let's say this is perhaps in a way the kind of most important slide. It's what are we actually assessing? So we're at the deployment phase and we're assessing model, or we're assessing data, or whatever it may be. So for us, we call them the 4 verticals. These 4 verticals, we've distilled them from all of the different literature, from our readings of generally how risk is being mapped in systems themselves. And for us, there are 4 verticals, the 4 verticals that we actually look at. The first one is algorithm privacy. So, this is something which we've been interested in theoretically for a long time. So here, let me motivate this problem by saying, given that we've done lots and lots of work in GDPR as a society, as engineers, as practitioners, why algorithm privacy? So I'll tease this out, and then later on people can ask questions about this if they're interested. But in all the audits that we've done actually in industry, seldom are people actually interested in algorithm privacy. And the reason for that is they say, we spent so much money on GDPR, we've done so much work on data governance that it's already covered. It's our position that algorithmic use or algorithms introduce new privacy concerns above and beyond GDPR compliance. So one could be completely compliant on the GDPR front, or have very good systems of data governance, but new kind of privacy concerns can emerge by the use of particular kinds of algorithms. So that's our position, but to be honest with you, it's a theoretical position, and there's not too much kind of empirical, there's not too much of a body of evidence or case studies developing in that space. Second one is bias, and I think probably bias is in terms of the general social, let's say the kind of journalistic and general community space, it seems to be the most important driver. And here, what we're talking about when we're assessing, in quotes, the bias of the system, is we'll be looking at how a system performs against different protected characteristics. So it has an intimate relationship with personal data or sensitive data, and it's usually about how the system is performing in different ways against different demographics. This is particularly context dependent. So if we were looking at bias in recruitment systems, or we were looking at bias in medical systems, we'd be looking at different kinds of bias. Again, there is let's call this the technical assessment of bias. And then there's the whole kind of societal, legal, ethical discussions of bias. And there's a relationship between what we're doing technically and those kind of questions. And if we've got time, I'm more than happy to have a discussion about that. Next is explainability. So I think it's really important to kind of disambiguate explainability as we've posited it here, and accountability or transparency. So explainability, we're looking at technical explainability. We'll be able to say, can we assess why a system has made its decisions, or how explainable a system is, and can we do we have a position on what is a reasonable level of technical explainability vis-a-vis the use case in a particular case. So if a decision is being made, so I was thinking about an example of a high-risk system that would have low explainability but might be able to be justified, and it may be, for example, in DeepMind's protein folding models. So if they use some very complex systems, not particularly explainable, but that's fine because the way in which that result is used is just churning out possibilities that research scientists can then go and use. So it's way beyond just like, here's a recommendation, now go and produce a drug off the back of it. And then finally, promote performance and robustness. And you can see that there's two kinds of, the reason why we use two things here is just, it's a kind of bucket. It's things like reliability, reproducibility, it's stress testing, it's fragility, security. So what we find, accuracy as well, of course, and what we find overwhelmingly is that these systems, when we do an audit, is that whatever other vertical we assess, we always assess accuracy and robustness. And the reason for that is, what's the point in assuring or assessing bias if the system is all over the place, or if the system is super fragile? So in a way, I think a kind of general movement in this space is that actually algorithm auditing, even if it's motivated by concerns of bias or explainability, it will de facto be assessments on robustness of the systems or accuracy of the systems. And I think that's going to lead over the time actually in an algorithm improvement or improvement in the industry. So I'm just going to take a quick question. I saw the question by Susanna about, would algorithmic privacy not be integrated and grouped into explainability? So, so this is a very complicated question. So as I read it, it's a complicated question. One is sometimes it can be a trade-off. So it can be that, is there a trade-off between making a system more explainable, or let's say mitigating such that we make the system more explainable, and it coming at a cost of privacy or algorithmic privacy. So there's a trade-off analysis in that space. And secondly, in terms of, it depends on what we mean by privacy as unintended leakage or data minimization, or being able to infer certain things from the use of a particular kind of model. So so explainability is much more explicit assessment of why is the system acting in the way that it does, whereas the privacy concern is that it's inadvertent or that it's liable to expose data. So that's really kind of where we were skirting at. So again, everyone, please just jump in with questions, etc. So here, I think, so what we wanted to do at this point, and again, I'm not too worried about just like, hi, Manuel, go for it, Manuel. Manuel, I think you're muted.
Yeah, now can you hear me?
Go for it.
You need to unmute me. So nice to meet you. How far did you go back to your previous slide? How far did you go in terms of assessing explainability? Did you go in terms of algorithm being used, or let's say technology, if neural networks might be more explainable than trees? Or how did you assess that? It was only technologically, or did you assess also in terms of the usage or the application? Because that's really interesting.
Yeah, so in this case, very much about the system.
All right.
So it was very much about the system. It's just about, let's say we did a recruitment assessment. It was just to say what went into the recommendation, and it was in order to assess whether or not that was reasonable or unreasonable.
And did you apply also a kind of let's say penalization if the people did not contain the explainability from design, but just after, or you didn't apply this one?
No, so this is a really good question, because this is a whole separate space, which is everything we're doing here is only meaningful if we understand the context of use. So let's say at a very basic level, let's say we were looking at a trading algorithm. It would be meaningless for us to do a bias assessment. So usually what we're doing at the first stage at a very abstract level is just, what is the use case? How is it being used? And then we assess, okay, this is what we need to assess these kinds of risk. And if explainability fell into those kinds of risk, then we would do an assessment of the explainability. And then we would assess whether or not that was appropriate given the use case.
Mm-hmm.
So if, let's say it's going to come up in a few slides about the level of audit. So this is all just interdependent on what's the level of risk in terms of, is this a kind of high risk system? And is that risk mapped to, in this particular case, privacy or explainability? If yes, then let's assess privacy and explainability. We've assessed explainability. This is what we've got. And then we would say, given the use case, given the performance of the system, here are some issues. And then we would suggest mitigation strategies.
Exactly. So you optimize, if I understood right, you optimize the process for auditing based on the user case. So in that case, for example, in bias would make no sense if you are using wood production, because that's why to make it, right? So
yes, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So the big problem, and I think probably all of us agreeing in this community, the big problem is what is the target is. We want to ensure trustworthiness. So like we need to know what is relevant to trustworthiness in a particular context. So otherwise, and then this is why, in a way that you'll see in the next coming slides, what we're doing is we're providing a suite of tools in terms of where and at which point and according to which vertical we can do an assessment or an audit. So what we're interested in is to say, okay, remember, we're talking about this from a technical perspective. At what point are we doing the audit? On what risk metric are we doing the audit? And given that interrelation, then a particular kind of assessment will take place. So if we're doing a fairness assessment at the data and task setup, then we might look at population balance. If we're doing it at the productionization and deployment phase, it might be real-time monitoring of bias metrics. So the point here is that in a way, we have to say, what are we searching? What risk are we looking at? At what point in the systems pipeline are we looking at it? And what is the appropriate assessment of that? Hence here, why we're pointing to, there's a repertoire, a suite of tools that we can use that are appropriate for particular points of the system. Hope that makes any sense. I hope that makes sense in terms of this slide. Just picking up on Maria's point here, I completely agree that governance and technical levels and the technical level need to go hand in hand. Absolutely. We're going to talk about that probably in the coming slides. And that's exactly what we are, that's exactly our view. That there could be, we don't want, if you go into a hospital, so if you go and you say, Mum, I've got a headache, you don't get rushed to the hospital and say, we need to do an MRI scan, we need to do blood tests and all the rest of it. You drink some water and you take a paracetamol. If you're going on and there's a structure in your brain, then you need to do an invasion, you need to do a surgical intervention, etc., etc. So you need to just assess the risk, the level of risk, before we can do it, before we decide on what the appropriate form of intervention actually is and the level of the assessment itself. So I so Kathy O'Neill said she is spending much more time assessing the context where the algo was created and context of use before doing the technical one. So in a way, I think that overwhelming majority of systems or auditing and assuring of systems will come by assessment of the use case. What's been really cool about the EU's regulation is that so this is very kind of counter-continental, it's a very Anglo-Saxon way of doing this, is instead of coming with a definition of high risk in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions, they've used a bunch of case studies. And what's cool about that is that it gives you a route one way in which you know that if this is an insurance system, if this is involved in talent management, then it's going to be high risk. If it's involved in critical infrastructure, it's going to be high risk, and so on and so forth. So that's been great about the EU's work. But more generally, I think it's not very difficult to assess that if you're using an algorithm in a medical context, it's high risk. So really, we're interested in the relationship between the technical audit or assessment and the use case, insofar as what should we actually be engaging in. So let me move on to the next one. Again, let's say related to where we've done the assessment, what the vertical is, etc., etc. Sometimes when we do a mitigation, most of the time we usually do a mitigation in terms of if we found a technical problem, let's say, sometimes people might think, well, the mitigation for that is a kind of technical intervention or a kind of intervention at the level of the code or the data. Actually, there's different kinds of mitigation strategies. Sometimes it's actually methodologies that can improve the outcome of the algorithm itself. And other times it's actually to introduce human mitigation. So the easiest one, and usually people see is a kind of panacea here, is that, look, if you've got a system that you're worried is high risk, just introduce sufficient amounts of human oversight, or just to reduce the level of its autonomy. So there's different kinds of mitigations that we can test or we can use. And those mitigations very much map where we found the problem. So let's say, going back to this slide, let's say we've done an assessment of fairness at the feature pre-processing. We said, okay, we're going to do an assessment of fairness representations, or in privacy, we're looking at data minimization. So accordingly, let's say when we've done these different assessments and we found problems, then we can respond very specific. This is in the technical space, when assuming that we're not going to use a human mitigation or process mitigation, we can respond specifically to that particular point. So the point here is that mitigations are intimately related to where we've identified the particular risk when we've done that particular system. So you're noticing here that we're going deep. We have a very strong relationship or correlation between how we're assessing the system, at what point, what vertical, and if we find a problem, how does one intervene in those kinds of spaces. So I think what's really important here is that all of these mitigations in this particular space are technical mitigations. And these are very, very compelling ways in which to say we have taken the problem of algorithm auditing and assurance seriously. You know, we're not just doing a kind of process audit. We're not just checking the context in which the system is used, but actually we're able to look at the system itself and be able to say, we found this or that problem, we've made this and that mitigation, and you can coherently report on this kind of stuff. What we're anticipating is probably lots and lots of activity will take place in this space. There'll be lots and lots of case law, lots of cases emerging in this space. And probably the way I'm reading the space as it stands is the decade will probably be staggered, where the first phase will be just people putting in risk management systems. And the second one will be probably codification of technical standards. That's how we're seeing it. So finally, assurance. So what do we mean by assurance? We've used the word assurance just as a kind of, you know, as a term to say, look, the stamp at the end. And this just brings us back into, you know, will we be assuring according to sector or general standards or regulation? So the UK is very much pushing for a sector approach, whereas the EU has gone for a horizontal regulation. My suspicion is that in the end, probably the UK will probably adopt a horizontal approach, because all of our discussion with the relative regulators in this space, all of the respective regulators, has been that this is very difficult. And there's lots of problems with doing a sector-specific approach. Namely, you might have a company or you might have a system whereby you need to report to multiple regulators at the same time. You might encourage, let's call it regulatory shopping, where you try to, let's say, eschew your system such that you're having to report to the regulator which you think is the least active. So there's also lots of problems with doing that, but maybe I'm wrong. And then it's just to look at certification. We've been looking at insurance in particular. That's been an area that we're really interested in kind of two ways, both ensuring to be able to create insurance for systems, should you have done an audit, or more generally, the kind of risks that are associated with algorithms and insuring against those risks, and how auditing can actually play a role in that kind of ecosystem. So this is kind of what we're, in a way, what we were doing in the theory part. This is really the kind of background to how we developed the kind of algorithm auditing space, or the kind of reference piece to this space that got initiated to actually go about and do audits. So I think what we do when we actually go about and do an audit, please anyone jump in and ask any questions. What we normally do is, and this goes to the point maybe some of the people were making in the question and answer, is look, the first thing we do is we just actually look at the project information. You know, how is this system being used? Who's using this system? What's going on? You know, and some of this is just very early on. We were just doing through interviews and checklists. So this was work that we were doing in the late 2020, so a year ago, maybe even before that. And a lot of it was just kind of questions, just asking and so on. And then we do a risk assessment. So here we look at actually the performance of the system itself, if it was a system that warranted that kind of intervention. So just to riff off the EU regulation, you know, when they make the point that, you know, you don't need to do code and data inspection for a spam detector, we completely agree. You know, the overwhelming majority of systems are not of that kind of system. They're not high-risk systems, so we have to warrant doing a code and data inspection. And one of the reasons why we want to avoid doing code and data inspection is that it makes algorithm auditing and assurance a very arduous task. it would be a huge barrier to let's say the adoption of algorithms, and actually it would be an unnecessary one at that. So yeah, so we do the risk assessment, we do our dive, that's all that stuff in the previous slides, and then we look at what is a what's an adequate level of governance. So that could be via technical mitigations or human mitigations, and then just looking at the general governance structure. So what we're interested in, this is just to make a point that I think Manuel's, the discussion with Manuel kind of teased that, is when you do an assessment, if I'm looking at a recruitment system, if I'm looking at a credit scoring system, for example, I know that I need to look at robustness and fairness. I probably also need to look at explainability, because the right to redress and so on and so forth. If I'm looking at a trading algorithm, we don't need to look at bias. There's no concern of bias whatsoever in that system. So what are we interested in? We need to be able to triage risk. We need to be able to look at what's the system being used for, and then what are the relevant risks accordingly. And then we go into assessing or auditing those particular risks, and then offer mitigations in that risk. So the triaging process, just being able to map where the risks occur, is very much the first and one of the most important parts of the algorithm auditing process. And then we look at, okay, when we're doing this, let's say the assessments, now we've distilled where the risks are, let's look at what standards are available, let's look at what the best practices is, and we can kind of assure and audit accordingly, and so on and so forth. Here is so I'll just pick up on the question in the thing here. So technology assurance is a mature advisory offering. And in this, many company offerings and algorithm assurance for a while, which makes it. It's really keen to hear more about one of your use. Yeah, we'll talk about some of the use cases, actually. We've got lots and lots of examples of this that we've done in industry. So what we're interested in, this work here, and I think it's important to look at this, is to say levels of algorithm auditability. So the Information Commissioner's Office have recently granted us, have given us a grant in the UK to look specifically at this kind of question. It's about, what level of access do we need in order to do an audit, and what is an appropriate level of access that we need. So let me say at the two extremes is, and this has happened where we've gone to a company and we've said, hey, so an example of this is, a large company is procuring a system. The large company has come along and said, can you do some due diligence on that system? So we go along to that company and say, hey, we've been tasked with doing due diligence on you. We need to have a look inside. They come along and say, IP. Okay, fine. We need to be able to say, how much assessment can we do? So first we need to assess what can we assess what can we assess when we have code and data inspection. So that's like level 1 access here. And right at the bottom is level 7, which is they're just reporting to us through some kind of questionnaires how their system is performing. This has lots and lots of implications. First, the level of access we have, intuitively and truly, the more we're able to feedback, the more we're able to assess and audit the system. And on the other extreme, but the more their IP is exposed for a particular company or system. And on the other side, the less access we have, the more the liability in telling the truth, if you will, lands on the vendor than it does on the procurer. So there's lots and lots of discussion here, and we can have that. This is the work that we're currently doing from a very research perspective. Again, I'm not going to go into too many details here. It's just to make the point about depending on the risk vertical, depending on what we're looking at, the level of access that we have gives us particular kinds of feedback that we can give to the system itself. So I think this is, if anyone has any questions on this, do stop me, but I think this is pretty intuitive here. Okay, awesome. I'm going to stop there before we talk about the examples and pilots, and just say any questions, any points. Just I'm noticing the question about, do you provide recommendations post-audit? So yes, we do. Hi, go for it, Maria. I think you need to be unmuted. Let me just unmute you somehow. Yes, go for it.
Hello. Hello,
Hey.
Emre.
Hey.
Sorry, I've been like really active. Have
No, how are
lots
you? I
of
hope you're
questions. Like, I'm good. I'm good.
Yeah.
Thank you for presentation. I mean, that's great to see the work you're doing, and I'm really keen to hear example of pilots because we don't have as many pilots to show us what happens in a case of audit. So I think we need to have those much more. But also the questions that I had for you is, we know the biggest problem we have is that once you perform an audit, you provide recommendations. So the first question is, do you implement those remediation, or the company or the team that have asked for the audit are left by themselves to do this? And is there any way for us to audit the or to assess, to check if those remediation were being put in place? Because at the moment, at least the conversation I had with Kazim, with Lisa Sullivan and others in the States, the biggest concern is that fine, we can perform those audits, but there's no incentives for us to have those remediation put in place, and also there's no incentives for those results to be made public. Therefore, we still operate in some sort of a black box of auditing type of black box. And in order for us to proceed and have meaningful progress, we need to also make these experiences transparent for the wider public, for different stakeholder groups, and take it from there, besides the legal requirements that will come more or less at some point in time.
Yeah, so what we're not interested in doing the remediations ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So like we're not doing the it doesn't make sense to audit a system to be incentivized to find problems in order to justify doing more work for a particular. It's better that this is distinguished.
Dependent.
So we would make recommendations, but we would not implement those recommendations. Secondly, and in a way, I would put the question to the people that you've mentioned and say that it depends on the meaning of, it depends on what they're saying. If they come along and say, hey, you need to do a impact assessment. This is a good example. You need to do an impact assessment on unintended consequences. I'll say, okay, cool. Like, how do you do that? Now, give me a bunch of ways in which to do that. Show me a system of doing that, and like give me a way to actually do this. So what's good? And that's something that I've already come across in industry with one partner that we were working with, was that when they were asking about when they were given comments about here's some residual risk or here's some risk in certain kinds of impact, and it was basically impossible to mitigate those kinds of risks. So it was a kind of identification of a risk that, and to say that you should do something about this in a way that was not actually it wasn't possible for them to actually intervene, or maybe there wasn't a public standard, or there wasn't a methodology that's been developed. Then there's the second extreme, which is when we might do an assessment of a system and say, here's a specific problem. When we're coming up with much more granular, let's say, assessment, then it's very straightforward to look at whether or not they've actually made those kind of interventions. So it's really, really, it's very important to think about the nature of let's say, the recommendation. If the recommendation is a technical recommendation, they might say, you know what, upon reflection, we've decided that we don't want to do that. But that's fine. But but that will be an explicit thing to be made to make a discussion on. It just depends on the nature of that. So the two extremes that we look at is technical recommendation, which is easy to assess, right? Because we can just see whether or not they've done that. And the other extreme would be this kind of impact assessment. Do you have systems to capture unknown risk, unintended risks, etc.? And these are two. So it's even our ability to assess whether or not, let's say, the remedial actions have taken place. Very much depends on having a very quantifiable dimension of what that means or what that counts as.
Okay, thank you.
So Manuel, what was that you pointed is doing a clever way? I've actually seen ethics grade. And I looked at it the other day, and I think the problem with this approach is that they have no sentience on the use of the systems, to the best of my knowledge. To my understanding, they just do public searches of what the companies are avowing in these particular spaces. And my view has been pretty much that you can have extremely powerful marketing mechanisms that can signal that a company is doing X, Y, and Z, and not have much correlation to what's actually taking place. So my general view is, and I'm very keen that the space that we're doing is not reducible to, let me say, brand management or a competent and powerful form of marketing. Sorry, go for it, Manuel.
Yeah, it's actually from what Maria is saying, is basically that what is the incentive from the company to improve that? If there is not a need, or let's say there is not enough budget to improve any specific stuff that is working on the design. And I think it's quite important to mix the intrinsic and extrinsic values in terms of the companies. So in terms of grading or evaluating publicly the information is quite relevant to create a competition where there is some incentives in terms of improvement on a middle term. But this is coming to the marketing point and not from the research point of view. That's I fully find mechanism where the people are going to be motivated at some point to improve what you said that they can improve actually, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's about then your intervention. This is my fear. The intervention would be increase your marketing budget. Like as in, so let me talk a little bit, and this is, I'm sure there's also practitioners here. My view is that the rational position for a company is not to do an audit. So I look at people who are doing audits in this space. I look at them as actually probably progressive. Yeah. So like, you know, so yeah, companies. I agree with you, Maria. Sorry, I meant to say in a kind of broad sense, in the I mean, maybe in the way all three of us are discussing about why we need to be public about this, why we should be motivating this, stimulating the space. So an example of this, and I've been looking at it as a kind of case study, is the current movements in terms of the climate and environmental impact. And like, there's a huge disconcertedness amongst a lot of the community that have been doing this for a long time, that it's just exploded, but it's not meaningful. So like, we want to avoid this. I think, to be honest with you, we're not going to be in trouble in this space because there's regulation coming, and it's going to become a real compliance issue. And then really all of these kind of where we are now in the kind of regulatory space, it's going to just be dissolved because it's going to be a legal requirement to be able to demonstrate, and to be able to demonstrate that you've done these, you've put the appropriate processes in place, you've got the assessments done. So I think it's going to be okay eventually, and I'm not sure how long that's going to take. But in the meantime, as a way to kind of really try to motivate this space, I think it's really important for us to take the problem serious from let's look at the systems themselves and try to build up this case law. Sorry, go for it, Maria.
I've been thinking about the incentives of doing responsible AI, which is obviously the prerequisite of performance audits. And I wonder from your experience, Emre, if you think that audit will accelerate the adoption of proper AI governance models within enterprise. And the second one, I think what you're saying about identifying use cases where there is a public demand for responsibility, and you mentioned climate change. I think it was interesting. I found a study performed by The Economist last year on the business case of responsible AI, and they were mentioning that 66% of the consumer interviewed, they expect fairer algorithms. So I wonder if we want to kind of empower companies to perform those external audits, to go where the consumer demand transparency. And also, you know, another question for you is, what do you think about public sector? I mean, the fact that you guys are working with the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation, which, let's say for the non-UK participants in the workshop, is a UK department that's tasked to look into the many issues of ethics for the government and application of AI and data systems in the UK. So I wonder if we should not continue and start and continue with algorithms in public service, where those audits are being performed and we publish not just the result of the audit and the remediation, but also the impact of the remediation processes. Because if the government leads by example, I'm sure that many will first acknowledge that this becomes really serious. And secondly, there will be some, as you said, Emre, that will continue to lead and to be opening the space, and will strengthen their competitive position by doing this.
Yeah, just to pick up on the public sector approach. So this has been something that's been percolating for 2 years. And it's the kind of the ability vis-a-vis government procurement to drive high standards in industry. So the way we were looking at it was that if you've got these public sector procurement standards for any use of automation or automation of systems, then it would become de facto the standard without having to regulate. So that's where the UK government has kind of landed. So the other day, the Cabinet Office published their public sector standard, algorithm public sector standard. And if you look at it, there's an open call for pilots. And the pilots are with government. So what they're interested in is doing these assessments in the public sector, publishing them. And then there was a question, because we went to the launch of this, the pre-launch of this in Whitehall, and there was people were asking, well, does this account for systems that are procured, or or just systems developed? And they will say, oh, we're not sure, whatever it is. But I mean, intuitively, the government doesn't build these systems. Overwhelmingly, the governments are the public sector systems are procured. So it's kind of a way to do that. I completely agree, Maria. I think there's advantages to doing this. So the EU is taking a very different approach. It's just saying, any kind of deployment of a system needs to be assured in a particular way, or meet this kind of the proposed regulatory compliance standards. UK government is using this kind of other approach, and one of the advantages of doing this is they don't want to get it wrong, which I completely respect. I think it's a very difficult space. We can talk maybe about the different regulators that we often speak to, and everyone is cognizant that this is not a trivial task. Creating reasonable and future-proof standards in this space is really difficult. That's why I salute the EU's intervention, even if I've got a bunch of criticisms, and I also salute the different approach that the UK government has proposed. So it's a way to kind of, allay that concern. And secondly, and probably more importantly, and this is a very strong position of ours, and I think we're aligning on this point, Maria, is that there's got to be some kind of case law or evidence base. They're like, let's just start to get some of this stuff out there. This is how people have tried this, or this is how people have tried that. And because the market is not incentivized, well, as I said, probably the rational position is not to do this until absolutely necessary, even though it doesn't really make sense. This is a way to force that kind of evidence base to emerge anyway. So I think it's a really subtle point here. I agree with you completely. I think, to be frank, there's gonna be a point of no return. The horse will bolt, and then people will just be panicking. Oh God, how much money did we spend on GDPR? How much are we gonna have to spend on this AI space? But who knows? Sorry, Manuel, go for it.
Yeah, go first. Finish it if you want.
I wanted to say I so want the Emre to panic. Because everything that we have said in the last 5 years alone about the risk of AI finally hits home. So I want them to panic, because AI is generating now huge volumes of value. So no, they have to panic. They have to get their act together. And let this point of no return come quicker for all of us, because then we'll be in a better position. Thank you, Manuel.
Yeah, let the people scream and run.
Yes.
What I think is really, really relevant to what Emre is saying, and it's one of the things I'm discussing with other people working on some measurements, is basically that we need to have data. We need to have data to evaluate this, what we're going to need in some parts of 2 years. But what I want to highlight is basically, my question was related with actual explainability, accountability, what we, in terms of meta-analysis, we call it ethics in AI. It's actually at some point, and I want to ask you, if you did have cases where it's economical incentive, it's worth it, because in my point of view, implementing at some stages, depending on the size of the company, items like MLOps, for example, in terms of accountability, in terms of explainability, also for healthcare. I mean, they are already trained in terms of, auditability and so on. But when the company is growing up and they need to develop more models, and they need to have much more work and much more optimization in terms of delivering models for different application, is accountability, traceability, or for example robustness for an e-commerce mandatory to economical incentives. It's like basically they need to have this to have a, let's say, competitive product, and it's ethics filling this part. But I don't know if the people are seeing this already.
It's interesting because it looks to me, I have a strong view that we will never have to codify, let's say, accuracy. We would never need a legal mechanism because it's just such a strong market motivation to get that right. So like, I don't think we're going to need to codify that. I think it's probably going to be the contentious area is probably bias, where we might need a kind of regulatory intervention. But there's just I completely agree, there's such a powerful market motive to just have good algorithms. Like, what is the point? That's why I was saying, every time we end up doing an audit on assurance, we always look at like how is the model performing generally? So the rest in a way falls on top of that. But I completely agree that because we're coming from what I'm coming from, non-engineering perspective of tracking the governance and regulatory and policy documents, we're forgetting that there's this is the age of automation. Like the value that this provides to companies, or generally is enough of a motivation to say we need to have good risk management per se. So so it's interesting. The kind of the ethics side is very interesting, but it's that it's critical that this is going to be that companies themselves will develop systems that work, that are useful, and so on. So I agree with that. If I've understood you correctly.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah.
If I were to say what we see, because I work for PwC here in UK, Manuel, what we see with our clients is that the penny has not dropped the relationship between risks of AI and ethics of AI. I'm actually on a panel in half an hour to discuss the risk of AI. The fact that most of the AI risks are in fact ethical risks of bias, opaqueness, robustness, and so on, as Emre said. And the fact that this time, whenever you have an AI solution at scale, the current risk of the enterprise are massively augmented. We've seen with our clients starting to acknowledge that they run a risk of not complying with future regulation. They are terrified because, especially for big organization, it's very difficult to set up internal capability to manage AI risk. But to mention that if something goes wrong, the most precious asset of big corporation remains their brand. Enough to look at what Facebook, the situation Facebook is. They had to change their name so that people not chase them, but they're still there. So I think it's making this correlation in between the use of AI system at scale and everything else that company does to deliver upon the shareholder and stakeholder promise will demonstrate them how important to have a responsible AI system for the health of your business. End of story. There's no negotiation. But I feel like we're not there yet, and I'm hoping that Emre's work and everyone who does work in audit of AI will accelerate, because audit is the one proving that if you do this is what you actually get, or don't get, and this is what you need to be doing in order to achieve that responsible outcome.
Yeah,
Go for it.
Yeah, that's, I don't know, for some interviews I haven't like researched in the problem space since June regarding this exactly, like regulation and then also like talking with decision makers in terms of deciding the profile of the specification for the product, and if the customer is not willing to pay, they will not put it in place. So there is still an economical incentive from the customer side who is buying the product itself, who is deciding, no, I can't give you just this budget, so don't put me MLOps layers on it. And that's, or if it's not government related, or if it's not healthcare related, and then requires me to have this, I will reduce the budget to 50% because and that's still, I think the incentive is working in there. I think there might be a point, and I'm with you, Emre, that there might be a point where the people say like, oh no, okay, in the midterm, it's worth it to implement it because we can save here and here and here, but they need to have data to prove that, I think. Yeah.
Sorry. So one of the things I was interested in when I was looking at one of the reasons why I kind of push back, and I agree with you, Emre, that the reputational damage is just critical, and they have to be able to mitigate that. But I was thinking about how there's so many examples of like sometimes I see companies being bashed, and I think they're almost certainly not the worst. And like in a way, you're kind of, I don't know, I just feel like it introduces too much gaming. So like let's think of the kind of counter example of a company that's unfairly, their reputation has been unfairly damaged. So like having some kind of systematic or like, that's why I think the governance questions, the legal questions, the compliance questions are important, is because at least it gives us a kind of objective standard. And I've been thinking more generally about what is the role of the AI ethicist, and what is the role of, what is it that we're doing? So what we don't want to do as individuals and as companies is to lend our reputation or effectively sell our reputations and say, hey, look, we do this kind of stuff and you've been working with us, so it's okay. It's actually to say, here, this is a process. Let's surface the assumptions. Let's bring everything so that everyone is making clear and rational choices, and we can have a reasonable difference of opinion or pluralistic approach to why we went in one way or another. And that's something that a regulator or public group can actually reasonably assess. And like that's where I'm really keen that the space moves towards, because I think that in the long run, this is the only way to do it seriously.
True. No, I was wondering, since we have Ansgar here, and we know he's a master of all trades when it comes to certifications and standards. If standards and certification would not be what we need right now to actually enforce this best practices and processes in place. Hi,
You muted. I think we need to unmute him. I don't know how to unmute.
Okay,
great.
I am now unmuted. Thank you, Maria. Yes, certainly. One of the challenges at the moment is that there is no clear common baseline that we can refer to when we're saying we're auditing an AI system, and that getting standards settled is going to be an important point. It's actually being audited on the basis of this. We are certifying that you've implemented this particular process, and this is a process that the technical community has agreed on is, if not best practice, at least good practice. So I think a lot of the community is waiting for the standards development community to come out with these. It is an ongoing process, similar to the regulatory space. We want it as soon as possible, but it needs to be done well, which means to a certain point, you can't rush it beyond. The quality needs to be maintained. We do see that the first of this work is starting to come out. A number of the IEEE standards related to AI ethics have now been published, including, I think, an important one on how to embed ethics into the design process, the 7000 standard. ISO IEC is also starting to come out with some of its work. For instance, around bias, there is now a technical report has already been published. So this is not yet a standard, but it does provide important technical insights that can already be referred to. But we need to go beyond this. We need to come to the point where we can say, I'm being assessed related to this particular kind of standard. And one thing that we are also working on now within CEN and CENELEC related to the AI Act is to do a assessment. Is our way of doing conformity assessment, our existing methods for doing that as we've currently applied it to various software products and services, is that sufficient when it comes to AI, or does things like the continuous modification of machine learning, does that pose new challenges that we need to rethink some of the ways in which conformity assessment is actually being done? But it is, it's easy to jump on it and say AI must be introducing something new, so we need to develop a new process. It is probably better to first do a solid assessment, because we have a lot of methods tested and proven, and often AI, it adds a new wrinkle to it, but doesn't really completely revolutionize the way in which we need to do assessments. And I think we need to clarify that first.
Just so fantastic, thank you for that. Just to ask you another question, this kind of follow-on question is, what we see as the hard problem is not necessarily, there's lots of brilliant work being done in explainability. Robustness has got a huge literature behind it. But what's the relationship between that and public trust? So that's in a way the hard problem that we're trying to solve. Otherwise, I completely agree. It's just, we would have done like all the way, it goes back to Manuel's point about accuracy. It's like the engineers would deal with this. This is going to evolve in itself. But then how do we then get to the end point where people are not worried the robots are taking over, or some horrible evil's about to occur?
I think what you're pointing to is something that Kazukanka has done some really nice work on, in highlighting that when we look, for instance, also at the AI principles, that so many of them have been published, there is actually a set of core issues. These are the things that people intrinsically are concerned about. And that includes questions like, do I actually have control over my own life? Is this a safe system for me? But a lot of these other things are more instrumental towards helping you achieve that. And explainability is actually one of those instrumental ones. We're not really interested in explainability for the sake of explainability. We want explainability in order to be able to judge whether or not the system does what it claims to be doing, whether or not the values that it is implementing actually align with the values that I hold. Those kinds of questions we hope to be able to address by having explainability, but not explainability for the sake of explainability. And we also see that, for instance, in some of the work around standards for bias, where because it so much depends on the context in which you're applying something, whether or not this is a unacceptable bias, or actually it is a differentiation in the outcome that reflects that the system is doing the task it's supposed to be doing. The important part is actually clarifying what are the decisions that have been made here, and what is the reasoning behind making those decisions. Why are we optimizing for X as opposed to Y, instead of just saying we are doing X. And that goes back again to that point of being able to assess whether this system actually aligns with your values and what you need in order to be able to have a good life.
Awesome. I just noticed that Susanna, you sent a message. Do you want to speak? Because I feel like we haven't heard from you. You've been messaging, or should I just read the question out? Susanna's talking. It said that there was the case of Zillow. Let's go for it, Susanna.
Hi. No, it's okay. When you were talking about organizations doing audits and they're not necessarily motivated to release the results of the audits, I'm thinking, well, perhaps if Zillow had conducted an audit, the outcome might have been quite different. That's all.
Oh, no, I completely agree. I think it's, in a way, it's a bit like someone needs to be brave enough to start doing this, and then it will just like force everyone else to act. So I think that's something. Hopefully, the public sector standard, and that they're going to publish their results, and I hope that precipitates this kind of. I think all of us here know, in our own little circles in our worlds, that there's lots and lots of activity taking place. There's probably a huge amount of like cases for us to collate. And I noticed in the EU Act that they're provisioning for I think it's actually mandatory reporting of catastrophic failure or harm. But I think maybe just take a step back and say, is there a mechanism to report anonymously on just generally the performance of systems or how audits are being done? So like there could be ways of us to, actually collate this kind of stuff to build the evidence base.
There is an act about whistleblowing that is coming up. I mean, it's for the last year, but it's not exactly covering.
Yeah, whistleblowing in a way, it's a negative mechanism.
Yeah. That's I don't find it constructive in a way, but it's actually that it might be like practitioners might need that kind of a tools in terms of developing this internally in their companies. But then on the other point, I wanted to highlight also one thing that you said is actually that the trust needs to be in there. And I think it's not only the trust, but also the knowledge. I think knowledge and trust need to go together, because why I want to show explainability for a tool if the people doesn't know what explainability is, or if the doctor is not trained about what accuracy means for an AI system. And I think at some point, I believe that the social sustainability is going to be the new environmental sustainability in terms of awareness. And if you see the social sustainability, how they take place for 15 years when Greenpeace started until now that we start to have something, is a really great example to see that what hopefully will happen in this area, where we need to wait at least maybe 8-10 years that the people arise awareness and then push that at the same time. But we have also a timeline problem, because we have 2 years now until the regulation arrives, and then we need to have in these 2 years something that we can have data for pushing this and improving that. But it's a big concern that everything runs at the same time in terms of the panic what Maria was talking about.
I know that we're out of time, because I think it was 1:15, Francesca mentioned. So just to say thank you to everyone. Really, really enjoyed that, and hopefully we can all stay in touch. I think I'll just pop my email over to everyone. So really keen. I think we're all going to probably be seeing each other quite regularly at various points. But yeah, please do reach out. Thanks for everyone for contributing. This is really great.